Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making the time to join our webinar today. We're joined by Helena Morrissey, Chair of the Diversity Project, Emma Stewart, CEO at Timewise, Sarah Kaiser, Head of Employee Experience at Fidelity International, and Steve Butler, Chief Executive at Panther Southall Aspire and Executive Sponsor of the Smart Working Workstream. Please use the Q&A section to submit any questions you might have during this webinar, and we will aim to answer these during the Q&A session. I can see a few messages about audio. You don't need to worry about that. Your audio is turned off automatically. For those who don't know me, my name is Anna Maria Tuliak. I'm a partner at Ludgate Search, a specialist investment management executive search firm, and I lead the smart working efforts at the Diversity Project. Over the past year, Smart Working Workstream's objective has primarily been promoting flexible working within the investments and savings industry in order to encourage attraction and retention of best and most diverse talent and nurture inclusive workplaces. For the purpose of this session today, the terms flexible, agile, and smart working will be used interchangeably. As we know, smart working allows employees to do their best work where and when it works for both them and the organization. This includes flexibility on location of work, flexibility in working hours, and contractual flexibility. This way of working enables us to support all individuals to remain within the industry throughout all life events and cultivate an inclusive multi-generational workforce. COVID-19 and the current forced working from home have majorly accelerated the agenda for flexible working in location and working hours, proving that flexible working works even in our industry. It is, however, important to acknowledge that we're operating in exceptional circumstances which don't fully support flexibility and have its limitations. Employees are forced to work from one location only, and a large number of employees still don't have a suitable working setup and are juggling a number of demands. Flexibility on location could be further enabled as the government's long-term plans for easing the lockdown begin to take shape, and people in Britain could reportedly soon be given a legal right to work from home. To support our member firms in these challenging times, we have prepared a number of top tips and resources. And if you haven't done so already, please visit the Diversity Project website to find out more. Looking into the future, we believe that for our industry leaders, an innovative action plan for flexible working, it's imperative as reviewing savings to office infrastructure and also environmental sustainability. The Diversity Project is delighted to be partnering with Timewise, Aon, AXA Investment Managers, Fidelity International, and St. James's Place Wealth Management on the program to advance the agenda for flexible working within the industry. Over to you, Helena.
Well, thanks so much, Anna Maria. And first of all, congratulations on all the work that you've been doing, particularly since the event in November, when you kicked off the year-long program that you said was going to shift the dial on flexible working in the investment savings industry. I have to say, this wasn't quite the way we intended to shift the dial by having a whole coronavirus crisis and being forced into it. But it is going to be a potential game changer. You're right to point out that it's not the same as true flexible working, this forced giant mandatory working from home experiment that we're on at present, but it is showing people from the leadership of our firms right down to the most junior staff that it is possible. That sometimes we don't know things possible until we actually can see them in action, and it probably would have been very difficult to achieve the mindset shift that we're already seeing without something dramatic, not desirable in its own way, but certainly one of the silver linings. Now, what I wanted to just emphasize at the start of our really interesting discussion this afternoon, I'm really looking forward to the presentations, is that I am seeing a real change in attitudes from the leaders of the firms that are members of the Diversity Project. We have seen a move away from the initial focus purely on operational issues when the coronavirus lockdown was first introduced, to now a real emphasis on well-being. And I can report firsthand, being party to discussions about how we need to learn from this experience and be more modern in our approach to working practices, including obviously welcoming more flexibility. CEOs have admitted to me, they said, well, I never envisaged working from home, and now I know that it really works. And of course, it's right the way down to personal assistants who previously really weren't able to secure working from home arrangements often because it was perceived as absolutely necessary that they were in the office. And all of that is being swept away. I also wanted to mention at the start that although this isn't about making it easier specifically for women in our industry, then I think we're all conscious that one of the feedbacks that we get repeatedly from women in our industry is that it becomes very difficult to combine family and career and other things going on in our lives as we further our career and as we work within more restrictive working practices than in some other industry. So I'm very confident that this experiment, as I've referred to before, will help if we can sustain some of the learnings, build on the learnings, that it will help us to also achieve better gender equality. It's helping men to play a bigger part in their families' lives as well. And several have said to me, actually, you know, this has opened my eyes as the issues that women in my life are facing day to day. I just went off to the office before and didn't see what was really happening. So it's not the way we intended things to happen, but it is a great opportunity. I know that the research that Emma is going to talk about has taken into account the experiences of the coronavirus lockdown. I do want to urge that everybody takes the ideas back into their own workplaces. This is a very collaborative effort. We are trying to change practices that are industry-wide and cultures that are industry-wide. And with your help, I'm really confident that we can do it. So over back to Anna. Well, actually, I'm going to pass to Emma at this stage, aren't I? So we're not going to waste our time on going back and forth. So over to you, Emma, to share the research. And thank you for joining us.
Anna, thank you very much. And Anne-Maria, delighted to be here and delighted to be sharing the research that we've done. As you say, we set out with a partnership last November to shift the dial. It certainly shifted. I don't know how far it shifted, but I hope some of the insights that we can share today will help it to shift further. Just by introduction, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Emma Stewart. I'm the co-founder and chief exec of Timewise. We are a flexible working consultancy and we advise all kinds of firms on how to improve their approach to flexibility, from change programs to training managers. We're also a social business, and so we work really hard and we undertake research and campaign work to try and build a fairer, flexible jobs market for all. So, as Helen said, that may be for women who need to balance work and care, for older workers, or for those with health issues, for whom often structural inequality in terms of how jobs are designed prohibits them from being able to either stay in work or progress their careers. So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes talking relatively quickly through the research that we have done. I'm just going to share my screen with you all now. Oops, there we go. So just to recap, we were delighted to partner as an organisation with Diversity Project back in November. The aim at the time was to undertake a one-year programme in 3 parts. The core purpose really was to try and understand what are the industry-specific barriers to enabling more flexible and smart working. And we looked to do this through 3 ways. The first is to do a deep dive piece of research, which is what I'm going to share with you today. Phase 2 is to, from that research, develop some recommendations and action plans that we will support partners to test and to try and create some solutions to improving flex in the industry. And then the third part is to share what works. So we are sort of merging all of that at the moment, because clearly we are learning about what works on a day-to-day basis. It suffice to say that we have, so that's what we're looking to do. We've been really pleased to be partnering with 4 organisations who have supported the research as well as the Diversity Project, and who have been really helpful in giving us some insight into the way the industry is currently working. What I would say, actually, I'll just talk about the methodology in a minute, but I guess a couple of points on the context within COVID-19 before I dive in. It has been a catalyst, as we all know, and as both Helena and Anna-Maria have said, I think the point to make is, whilst there is huge opportunity here, there is also a big gap between enforced remote working and a strategic, systemic approach to flexible working. And the gap clearly is around leadership, organisational culture, behaviours, and also management capabilities when it comes to designing work differently. And I'm sure many of you will obviously have embraced the enforced remote working, and will be doing it well. I guess the challenge is, what do we need to do differently in order to bridge the gap between that and a much more systemic approach, which takes into account the well-being of our workforce. It takes into account how to do this in an inclusive way, and how to make sure that it also is of commercial value. So it's in that context that what we wanted to do today really was to share the findings of the research, reflect what we learned about the industry pre-COVID, what is shifting now, and to frame our recommendations in the context of how we need to embrace this in the long term. So in terms of the methodology, just to say, this is qualitative research. We conducted a number of interviews with industry insiders, with industry bodies, with representatives from leadership and managers, both in front office and back office roles, all of whom were working actively in the investment and savings industry. So I'm going to talk you through the themes of the research. We also crunched some data, and we obviously looked at what the world was like pre-COVID. Suffice to say, as most of you will know, and as Helena referenced, I guess the first point to make in terms of our insights, and I've got 4 to sort of share initially, is when we entered into this partnership, it was on the basis that there was a real drive from the Diversity Project to look at how the industry could effectively improve its approach, with a recognition that in many ways there was a sense of being behind the curve when it came to embracing flexibility. Certainly in terms of what we saw and what we learned from our research, there is a shift in attitude that has obviously been escalated now, but there is a recognition amongst leaders that the industry needed to do more to embrace flex. What we saw from the research and what we heard was, even pre-COVID, there is definitely action that has been taken on remote working, but some of the sort of tougher issues to crack in relation to kind of culture and behaviours were slower to really start to shift. And I guess the context behind that, as we know, is this is an industry that attracts brilliant people and often keeps them. Turnover is relatively low. So I think there is context in relation to maybe not necessarily learning as much from other industries, but certainly having an openness to remote, but not necessarily different forms of flexible working. The second point to make is around stigma. And we certainly saw from our research that there has been, and still persists, we believe, a stigma when it comes to individuals asking to work flexibly. And some of that is perceived by individuals, and some of that is a real stigma. We know obviously from the data that the industry has a gender pay gap that is higher than national average. And we also know that the industry very, very rarely advertises roles flexibly from day one. So there are some real operational barriers here, but there are perceived barriers. And individuals told us that those barriers relate to a perceived risk of their value if they ask to work differently, a very real risk around bonuses, and a risk around progression opportunities as well. And so what often happens, or what we saw from those that we spoke to, is that there is effectively a non-conversation often, where individuals do want to have a conversation about working flexibly, but often will assume that it won't be possible and therefore will not ask. And the risk from the feedback that we had is that managers are then and leaders are not necessarily seeing that demand is there, and therefore not necessarily reaching into it. So you have this sort of non-conversation and unmet demand. The third point I want to make is around, I guess, the industry really, individuals who we spoke to telling us that flexibility can often be hard won. So flexibility obviously now is happening in terms of remote working absolutely everywhere. But pre-COVID, there was a real sense that to ask to work differently, whether it was part-time or to ask to certainly shift ways of working, was going to be quite a difficult conversation to be had. We were given feedback that often it is reserved for particular groups. So people who we would sort of classify as staff and managers are often enabled to work flexibly. Very interestingly, I think there is a huge amount of flexibility if you are in a very senior role. And what we heard was that often it's because you are incredibly autonomous in how you make that job work. So you are effectively able to negotiate at that level a degree of flexibility that works for you. The challenge from those that we interviewed was that often that flexibility is not necessarily offered further out to new entrants or to those in junior teams. And what we also heard was that in terms of thinking about how to have that conversation, many organisations were also looking at it through the lens of people with caring responsibilities. And we would reflect back that there is a shift here that is obviously starting to happen now, which takes you into from a request response mode of we will do it for certain groups and for certain demographics to an aspiration to try and be what we would call reason neutral. So organisations that are very good at flexibility will not ask why or will not have a perception as to why you need it, but will have a reason neutral approach. The fourth sort of theme I want to kind of draw on with this, and I should say we're going to be sharing these findings tomorrow morning, so all of this information will be available. But the fourth point is specifically in relation to the different types of flexible working that are and aren't offered. And as we said, we saw pre and currently, obviously there's a significant amount of remote working, but we know that the industry as a whole offers less part-time working. Part-timers represent about 7% of the workforce. And the reason underpinning that we heard from people was that often jobs aren't necessarily redesigned to accommodate part-time. There are legitimate operational but also cultural barriers to this in terms of client-facing roles. But there are also often options to resize roles that in some instances with very, very proactive managers are being considered, but the approach isn't necessarily consistent. So again, I refer to the sort of non-conversation, which is that where people are keen to ask the question about part-time, they may often not bring it up because there is an anxiety that it may well be granted, but effectively the role isn't fundamentally going to be redesigned, so their hours aren't, and the output that they are required to do won't necessarily reflect that. Now, clearly, I think that's a call out for any industry when it comes to designing jobs that are part-time in relation to what's happening now in the context of work and care. And we certainly know, and we are seeing very much so, that there is a very quick shift in this climate from enabling people to work at home with children, obviously, who they are homeschooling, and to try and make that work, through to a longer term recognition and shift that we have a precarious balance between how we balance work and care in society generally, and a need to look at how to reduce hours and output accordingly. So in terms of where the feedback sort of took us, what I would say is we've definitely seen a shift, and we've heard that there has been a shift in the industry, but there is definitely a recognition amongst those that we spoke to, and certainly business leaders, that there is more work that needs to be done. And what we heard from very senior managers within the organisations that we spoke to is a recognition in this current climate that we are facing a very sort of marked lens on us as organisations, and there is a real need to come out of this crisis into a longer term approach to flexibility that will reference us as employers of choice. And there is also, just some quotes here to sort of reflect on, a real sense that we have considerably raised expectations now amongst individuals who may previously have not felt they could ask due to stigma, but are now seeing their organisations adapting and knowing that they're adapting. And there is a real recognition that for businesses to be able to come through this and retain really, really good teams and maximise their potential, they are going to need to address these conversations as we start to look at what a return to work will be, but clearly over a long period of time where there is going to be an expectation that certain ways of working flexibly will need to be retained. In order to do that, the last point I'd make, just sort of on the themes before I move on to the recommendations, is there is also a recognition that if we are to respond to a broader range of flexible working options for individuals within the industry, there is a real need to build management capabilities around this. So to make that shift from a conversation that relies on a very, very positive manager who is very open to flexibility and an individual who puts that case forward, but which happens in pockets, to a far more systemic, consistent approach where all managers are proactively able and supported and skilled to have these kind of conversations with individuals at any point in their career, from entering into an organisation through to progressing, and at regular points throughout their working month, working year, to ensure that actually if flexibility is on offer, it's regularly reviewed. And that, I think, is something that obviously we are having to face into very quickly now, but is something that we need to make sure as organisations we retain those proactive conversations and we look at how to address a more consistent approach. And in terms of individual choice and individual feedback, again, the conversations we had at the beginning of this research are really starting to shift. What we saw very clearly was the way to start to make a more proactive approach is really to understand what that latent demand is within organisations. So employee demand for flexibility, as I said earlier, is often not necessarily fully understood. There is not necessarily an understanding of what type of flexibility an individual may well need and what type of flexibility is able to be offered. And obviously at the moment we would expect and we understand that lots of firms are undertaking pulse surveys on a consistent basis. And now is the time more than ever to really start to hardwire some conversations about flex into that process. So the shift that we've certainly seen organisations starting to take and that we would advocate is effectively, as I said earlier, one from taking an approach that is obviously reacting to a crisis when it comes to remote working, through to moving to far more proactive approach, to being able to have proactive conversations and proactively encourage support around flexible working. And that shift fundamentally is what we class as a flexibility maturity curve. We look at industries from all kinds of shapes and sizes, and we try and assess and benchmark many industries on this flexibility maturity curve. Our analysis in terms of investment savings from all the conversations that we had was certainly even pre-COVID-19, you as an industry are very, very good at remote working, and we would say it was very much at a 4. The challenge when it comes to other forms of flexibility, our assessment was it was probably nearer a 2 to a 3. And I think, again, that's the bridge that we would hope to be looking to address. So in terms of what to do, so that was what we found. What came out of our initial analysis, that there are 3 real areas for opportunity for both individual organisations and the industry to effectively build a flexible working action plan. And they are clarifying what your offer is when it comes to flex, looking at what can be done to tell the story and to shift the culture, and then building management capabilities. And just briefly, I will summarise some of the recommendations that we suggest within this approach. In terms of clarifying, as I said, the feedback that we had was very much that individuals aren't always sure what kind of flexibility is on offer. They're not necessarily being encouraged to have those conversations with managers, and it can happen in pockets. So for organisations to be proactive and systemic, that means having a really clear definition of what kinds of flex is available within your organisation, having real clear guidance and information to proactively promote that, and then making sure that that is hardwired into how managers are able to have those conversations. So is it part-time? Is it remote working? Is it shifts in start to end of day? Is it a combination of all or some of the above? Secondly, supporting a culture shift. This is very much about leadership engagement and obviously endorsement. We've talked about this before, but it comes over repeatedly and repeatedly. That's about how individuals and senior leaders can role model ways of flexing, and also making sure that conversations about flexibility are really hardwired into a whole organisational process. So asking yourselves questions, do we talk about this at the point of recruitment? Are we open to a conversation about flexibility? And to what extent, when we are looking at how we manage our office spaces and our return to work, are we also looking at how we manage flexibility across teams? And then the third point, which again is really, really critical, and we've seen in many, many industries, is to bridge that gap between being open to forms of remote working, where at a cultural perspective, you would still argue there are lots of issues around presenteeism, even from a remote working perspective, through to building deeper capabilities amongst managers in how to understand how to design jobs differently. And that is about supporting managers to have those proactive conversations and making sure that they are able to scope and consider different forms of ways of working, whether it's through job share, whether it's through part-time, whether it's through different start to ends of day. There are a myriad of options that are far more than just having a flexible working policy. Just the last couple of points from me, and then I'll hand back. Clearly, as I said earlier, there is an opportunity to pivot into flexible working through this crisis. And what we have seen from the feedback we've had from individuals we've spoken to pre and currently, and from the data that we are seeing coming through from elsewhere, is it works. And the first thing to say is flexible working can work in organisations. Those that are able to work flexibly do believe they are trusted more, and they are more productive, and that is evidenced and proven. So there is something about challenging the perceptions here that this has not been possible and that we have anxiety. I would also say that it's really important to make sure that where people are able to express how well they can work, that we tell those stories really powerfully, because that is the only way to challenge perceptions. It is also commercially viable, as we've all said. We know that actually finding different ways of working can produce better output, and it can save on the cost of the buildings that we may or may not choose to return to. And then finally, I think there is a positioning piece for the industry and for individuals at this time. You know, we have choices here, and as business leaders, everybody is being watched very closely as to how they respond to this crisis in return to looking after employees, recreating a narrative between how to manage work and care, and ensuring that we look after the health and well-being of our individuals. And those conversations and how proactive industry leaders are is going to be really, really powerful, more so now than ever before. And really just a couple of points to end on. There is a real excitement, and there are some anxieties about how this opportunity will be able to help us to think about flexible working differently. The watch outs, as I think we've all discussed, are very much, you know, we do need to be really careful that when we do this, and it kind of comes back to a consistent approach, that we make sure that we do not retain biases around who can and can't work in different ways over this time. Those choices that happen with couples at home when it comes to who works and who works less or who works more are individual conversations, but organisations have a responsibility, we believe, to make sure that they have a really consistent approach to offering flexibility for all individuals. And then finally, just some takeaways in terms of very practical actions that we would recommend in terms of these next steps. So in terms of clarification, obviously, please do talk to, if you're not already, and ask individuals what kinds of flexibility they want to retain going forward. So make sure with your pulse surveys that you are asking those kind of questions, as well as what their anxieties are about coming back to work. Often people, if they haven't asked already, will have some really, really strong views on how they can work differently. And be really clear in terms of what your vision is. So whether that's internal action planning workshops to identify what that looks like, but starting to have those conversations about return to work now. And then in terms of culture shift, it really is about telling stories, and it's around that leadership role. And really do think about how you can support your line managers to be able to have the skills, the capabilities and the guidance they need to be able to start supporting those conversations. And I would just end by saying that I think, you know, there is a huge opportunity. We are looking forward to going into the next phase of this project, to working with the partners that have supported us to be able to share these action plans and recommendations. And I think the opportunity is to turn this from a reactive conversation into a much more systemic approach that is going to be for a different way of working that is going to be here for quite a long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, for that. I think I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this research, which I think was not only valuable for Fidelity in the short term, but will be in the long term as well. Now, I'm hoping that one of you might be able to share my slides for me. Lovely. Thank you very much. So just to, if we move to slide 1, to give you a little bit of context. Fidelity first introduced what we call new ways of working in the UK early last year. So this wasn't new to us entirely. And we define new ways of working as empowering people to decide how, where, and when they work. So very similar to Anna Maria's definition of smart working at the beginning. And this was inspired by recognizing the benefits to our people and to our organization of really building that trust between employee and manager to decide what works for them and to judge people based on their output rather than turning up at certain times. And a lot of work went into encouraging the adoption of this. Lots of policy documents, lots of manager guidelines. We frequently feature role models and case studies talking about how this has been adopted. So it's been really well received within the organisation. And even our new offices, we moved into new offices last summer, were designed to enable flexible working and with that in mind. So Fidelity wasn't starting from a very low base point. But even given that adoption, we were really keen to take part in this research to see how we could build on it and look towards the future. When I speak to people, colleagues, about what they value most about working for Fidelity, they'll often say flexibility, and people really value that opportunity to shape when and where they work from. But the reality is we knew that it wasn't equally well taken up in all areas of our business. Some of them were more resistant to working flexibly. We also knew that given that we want to be able to attract the best talent, not only from our sector, but increasingly looking at people from other sectors who can bring new skills to our workforce, we need to be able to compete in what we can offer. And finally, we're very aware that the investment management sector as a whole, as you've heard, is not as good on this as we should be. And we wanted to look not only at what we could do to further embed new ways of working, but to be a voice for change in the wider sector and hopefully prove that it works. So we decided to take part in this research to see how we could build on what we've done already. And we focused within our technology department, looking at the areas responsible for infrastructure, architecture, client engagement and distribution, and data. And we chose these areas because they were ones where it had traditionally been seen that flexible working was a real challenge. So if you move on to the slide, I'll share some of our learnings. What we learned really reflects what you just heard from Emma. So one thing that was really positive is we learned that perceptions of agile working, smart working had genuinely shifted. And there was widespread acceptance of it and recognition that this was something people could do and was a positive thing. But the most striking thing we learned was that we were in very different places on the Timewise maturity curve for our support for remote working, as opposed to our support for flexible working patterns. So when it comes to remote working, we're really high on the curve. People can work from anywhere. We've given them the tools to do it. They know exactly how to, and they feel supported to. But when it comes to reducing working, we found there was a tendency that someone may go down from, say, 5 days a week to 4 days a week, but their manager wouldn't necessarily reduce their workload accordingly. They would just start doing all the work they did originally in more compressed hours, and often working just as long. So we knew there was more we needed to do, not just to accommodate, but to encourage and support and build manager capability around flexible working patterns. Something else that we learn, which has also been cited here, is to be really clear on why we're doing this and what we see as the benefits. There are so many benefits, and in a way, people can get confused by the number that we listed in our original document. We need to be much clearer about why we're doing this and who it's for, and that it's got to be mutually beneficial for the individual and for the business. Otherwise, there can be a bit of a perception that this is something that works for the business and not for the employees. It's got to be a two-way street. And finally, we realised that while, as I said, most people genuinely really value the flexibility that we offer, we're not very good at shouting about it and letting people know that that's there. So when we look at our job adverts, we very rarely talk about the amount of flexibility on offer. We tend to advertise jobs as full-time working, when the reality is we would be much more open to a conversation about flexibility. If we don't let people know that from the start, they're not going to approach us to have that conversation. And so it's our responsibility to let people know what we stand for and how we can support them. So there's certainly plenty of actions for us to be taking forward. If you go on to the next slide, The recent situation, the coronavirus pandemic, really brought home what we were beginning to learn already from the research by Timewise. Fidelity was very fortunate that we were able to move very quickly to a home working position without sacrificing the service we offer to our clients, because we already had new ways of working in place. And we even had comments from some of our clients that they really thought we should think about moving our call centre staff to a home working situation. And we had to tell them we already are in a home working situation. You just haven't noticed any difference in the service you're getting. And that was really positive. But it's also made us realise that new ways of working aren't new anymore. They are simply our ways of working. And actually for the future, we need to build on them more. So just a couple of things I wanted to share with you that have really been highlighted by this for us. Firstly, those areas I mentioned at the beginning where we'd had a bit of resistance or always thought it would just be too difficult to do flexible working before, they're all working remotely, they're all working flexible patterns, and they're all doing it successfully. And funnily enough, those are the areas which are now coming to me and saying, our new ways of working policy is not flexible enough, and they actually want to encourage greater flexibility in their teams. They're identifying exciting opportunities for us to do things like proactively recruiting people with certain disabilities into roles where there'd be no need for them to travel to the office. So that's one real exciting learning. And I would say to any of you at the beginning of this journey, if you're hearing from a part of your business this can't be done, it probably can. The second thing that we're really learning is about what people want. And so when we look at our ways of working, the future ways of working, we are beginning to look at what we would need to do to return to the office. We're not in any rush to do so, but we certainly want to be prepared and ready to do so. And the big question that's come up is, what would be the purpose of returning to the office when many of us can work very well from home? And one of the answers that's come back most strongly is about connection and communication. Yes, there are a few roles where people genuinely do need to be in the office for certain reasons. The majority of us don't, but what we do miss is those water cooler moments, the informal coffees. And so actually that's something we've had to look at how we provide in other ways for people. And I think will be a part of our future ways of working. Not just how do we support people to work from home, what's needed for them, how do we support them to work in flexible patterns, but how do we continue to build those communities of people? And of course, for many of our people, they will be working more flexibly now. People who had spent hours commuting each day are now using that time for exercise, for meditation, or simply to get more done. I don't think any of us want to go back, but what we do want to do is make sure that, as I said, we're creating situations that work for the business and the individual. So for any of those organizations on this, thinking about where to start, the one thing I would say is you don't need to do everything at once. It's fine to take small steps and let people adjust. But what you will find is the more you support and enable flexible working, the more people will value it and the more you'll be able to do. So absolutely get started. I think Steve's going to share some far more interesting insights than I did about the impact of coronavirus on remote working and flexible working.
Okay, thank you. So I became the executive sponsor for the Smart Working workstream a couple of months ago, and it's been a delight working with the team. One of the reasons I took on the role was because I felt that this was a long time coming. 23 years ago, my eldest daughter was born, and I negotiated with my employer at the time that I would come in early so that I could leave at 4, so I could do my 2-hour commute to see my daughter before she went to bed. And I lasted about 6 months of constant abuse from my colleagues about working half days. And that's what led me to kind of leave the asset management side of the industry and set up my own business. So it's something that I think is important, and it affects so many people and the way that they work. So my presentation today, sorry, I just need to share the screen. So I'm looking at smart working, and I'm going to look at kind of the impact of the current situation, but I'm going to come at it from the approach of age diversity and how age impacts on your perspective towards smart working. The reason for taking this approach is I'm currently researching for my doctorate, and I'm researching the area of age discrimination in the workplace, and I'm specifically looking at the impact of stereotyping of all ages, not just older, but kind of younger people in the workplace. And last year I published a book about my experiences of managing an age diverse workforce within Punter Southall, and some of the challenges that I've faced within the business of kind of managing intergenerational teams. Now, when you look through an age lens, one of the challenges that you face is that there's a whole bunch of stereotypes that are not very helpful. You know, there's things such as boomer and millennials, and social media and the news have done their best to create conflict between the generations and generate a lot of negative emotions between the different generations. So I try to avoid using these terms. And in fact, the reality is, how can your characteristics of how you behave be entirely shaped on when you were born? So the way that I've looked at generations in the workplace is said, well, you know, what shaped people and the way that they behave. And I think the one thing from my perspective that's had a real kind of impact and really created a difference in the generations has been the internet. I see lots of people in the workplace that have grown up in a world without the internet and have had to learn how to use it and the associated tools that have come from it. And I see a different set of behaviors from a generation that have grown up with the internet and it's been part of their lives. So in my book, I describe the generations as an analog generation and a digital generation. And when I look at the characteristics of the analog generation, you know, these are people that have been in the workplace for 20 plus years. By nature and the way that they've worked in the past, they're very team orientated. They're quite formal in their approach to work, and they have a very strong work ethic. Because they've worked the way that they have for the last 20 years, they're very comfortable with 9 to 5 in the office. They like having their team around them so they can have those quick conversations and kind of move on to the next piece of work. They're very comfortable being dressed in their suit and tie at work, and they also keep their home life and their work life very, very separate. You know, they come to work and they do to work, go home, and the two don't mix. Because of their age, they're kind of strong on the emotional wisdom, and they have good customer handling skills. Now, when I contrast that to the digital generation, this is a generation made up of Generation Z and kind of millennials. The internet and social media has made them much more community orientated because they have much more kind of ways of interacting with different communities using the technology, much more able to multitask and kind of do lots of different things at different times, and they're very adaptable. They've been very influenced by their online culture, but they've entered the workplace with very high expectations of what flexibility looks like. And I think this is because they have a very integrated work and personal life perspective. And they come to work and they work hard, but they kind of want to stop to deal with their personal life when it occurs rather than waiting for a separate time. They like to come together and to collaborate. They don't like the formal historical work structures. It's not important to them. They don't appreciate the hierarchy that has perhaps existed in the past. And they crave a social purpose to their work. So those are kind of my observations from the kind of two cohorts that I see kind of in the workplace. So in response to the current situation, the challenge for my analog generation was going to be the new technology. They were going to have to embrace lots of different technologies and different ways of working. But the benefit of the current situation is that they've all learned together. We've all had a little bit of a joke online as we've kind of learned to use the tools, about whether we've got mute on or off when we're speaking. But because we've collectively learned together, we've really accelerated the adoption of these tools within this age group. We've also been forced to share our home life, where in the past we've kept the two separate. We've now got cameras into our homes, and we're having to share what's going on in our lives. I've seen that this group have also struggled to establish a new work pattern. They've been used to their 9 to 5 routine, and they're a bit unsure about when to take their break to do their exercise, and when to fit in different tasks within the day. However, they've absolutely embraced remote working. You know, I think it's been a relief for this age group to try working from home and see that it works. And the other interesting thing about this group is these are the middle managers and the senior managers that have perhaps been resistant to flexible working in the past, and they can now see that it works, and they've learned to trust their team members. They haven't had to check in on them all the time to make sure that the work is being done. And they've also realised that they've had to work harder to support their colleagues in this situation. They can't just turn around and talk to their colleague as and when they wanted to. So they've had to work much harder at this, but they've embraced supporting their colleagues in the workplace. From the perspective of the digital generation, I see that they've absolutely embraced the collective culture of the crisis. The fact that we've come together in communities to support local communities, to do work, to do the shopping for neighbours, etc., is something that this generation has embraced. The technology was always going to be easy for them, and they've embraced it. But they have worked hard, sort of mentoring and coaching their older colleagues to kind of learn the technology so that we can all work together. But surprisingly, I've seen this group struggle with the remote working because of the feeling of isolation. You know, this was the group that demanded flexible working, and we haven't got flexible working. We've moved from working 100% in the office to 100% from home. This is the generation that wanted to have some time in the office collaborating, some time in the coffee shop working on their laptop, and some time working at home. So the current situation hasn't met their requirements for flexible working, and the isolation they have felt has been much more challenging to them. And they've required more social interaction during their working day. So I have seen my analog generation, my managers have to work much harder to kind of fill that gap so that they have that interaction. And I think for this generation, they potentially also don't have the right setup or the ideal setup for remote working. Potentially, you know, they might be sharing a 1-bedroom flat with a partner where there's only one table, and they're taking turns to do their video conference calls, etc. So I think a kind of mixed response to the current situation when you look at it through the lens of age. So what's the current situation taught us, and what does the future look like? And I think, you know, to kind of reinforce my point, the current situation isn't smart working. It's just working in a different location. And the benefit of this is that it's taught our middle managers and senior managers that we can work away from the office. However, I think there are lots of valuable lessons for us to learn, which will help us adopt smart working in the future. You know, throughout this whole process, there's been lots of trial and error about what's worked and hasn't worked with the technology, what's worked with collaboration, what's worked with supporting colleagues, etc. So I think we need to think about what we've learnt and how we can apply these things through into the future after the crisis. So I think to conclude, you know, we've got a once in a lifetime opportunity after all the learning that we've had over recent months to kind of change the way that we work. I think everyone in the workplace has had an opportunity to reflect and think about their work-life balance, to think about what their future they might like their future to be. And I think as employers, we have tested one aspect of flexible working to see whether that works. So I think, you know, with my chief exec hat on, I'm sat here today thinking, well, what are the lessons that I've learned from all this, and what can I take away for the future? So for the three things that I'm looking at is firstly, I need to look at my flexible working policy, and I need to promote it to everyone in the business. I'm currently in a situation where my revenues are down, and I'm very focused on the bottom line at the moment. So there's potentially a real value to me if a number of my employees come back to the workplace and say, actually, I want to reduce my hours to a 9-day fortnight, or I want to change and have more flexibility from a part-time perspective, because that's going to support the financials of the business and potentially mean that I won't have to make redundancies where I would have to otherwise. So I think there's a real value to me in promoting flexible working as we return to normal. I think secondly, I need to look at the best practice of what we've learned. You know, we've learned a lot about how we run meetings, and what I do know for the future is I'm not going to have everyone in the room all the time. Lots of my meetings in the future are going to be partly online and partly in the room. So I need to take the learnings of kind of how we've managed meetings and project groups and follow that learning through. I think we've all learned a lot of new soft skills, and we need to remember these soft skills sort of going forward. And then thirdly, I'm looking at transforming my workplace, my workspaces. I've got 11 offices across the UK, and I'm currently thinking, do I really need that many offices? You know, if I've got part of my workforce working from home or working part-time, do I need as many desks in the office? When people come into the office, I think our work practices are going to be more about collaboration and coming together and sharing time. So I think there's some reconfiguration of our workspace to kind of meet this new style of working. And again, thinking about the bottom line, there's a real opportunity to reduce some costs in terms of office overhead, but perhaps kind of reuse some of that expenditure to have more events where we come together and share and collaborate in different ways. So that's me.
Thank you, Steve. First of all, some really great points shared from the Timewise research, and great to hear how Sarah's view on how Fidelity has embraced even further new ways of working. And again, Steve, thank you for sharing your experience with your researcher hat on, as well as a CEO of a business, and how you're adapting in a more innovative way. I am conscious of time. We had received a lot of really interesting comments and questions. So for those who are still on the line, I think we'll dedicate another 5 to 10 minutes on answering a few questions, because I am conscious that we would like to address some of these for you. So I actually received about 3 questions that are sort of addressing a similar point, and I would like to address this to Helena, if she's happy to answer those. They're specifically addressing the more challenging situation right now with sort of COVID-19 and crisis, and how this is affecting the sort of cultural and social norms at home, as well as the progression of women in the workplace. So I had 3 questions addressing specifically as the worry about the sort of expectations at home, and is this something that employers should be more proactive around sort of coaching different social roles, and how that should be navigated in this difficult time, in order not to put sort of women or more sort of marginalized groups sort of backward, which is also, Helena, in line with the recent article that was published on Financial Times. So what's your view on that?
I think there is something that individuals have a responsibility to do during this, and also that employers can help them with. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, I know we've got some of our member firms have produced guidance to their line managers, going back to the points that Steve made, which I thought were brilliant, about middle managers' attitudes changing and them realizing some of the issues around working from home, but they don't always get to see the other aspects of life. And I've had both positive experiences told to me and negative ones, where either a woman has just felt that she couldn't raise the fact that she's like a single mom and it's like impossible her life now, for fear of job insecurity, or at the other end of the spectrum, people being aware of that and actually proactively asking, are there times of the day that need to be avoided around meetings and so forth. So I think both parties have a role to play. We can't just leave it to chance. So we are going to be publishing, we continue to publish best practices for leaders. We had a great advisory council meeting this morning where 25 or so the CEOs were on the call, very engaged, and they are interested in what are the things to do right in this. So proactively coaching line managers to ask, without any fear of upsetting anybody. We tread on eggshells sometimes. We are letting people into our homes through the coronavirus crisis in some way. And there is a way to ask in a reasonable way. So coaching them, making sure that there are guidance about being sensitive to people's personal situations. And then if you are a woman who is struggling because your partner's not helping out or because you're on your own, well, first of all, have a proper conversation with your partner. We've been talking about that we women can't sort of try to do everything. We're not sort of superwomen here. There has to be a better situation at home to make it sustainable. And secondly, if you're on your own, then I've had to say several stories told to me where people have raised it. They've said they want to get the work done, they want to be judged on their output, but they need to work differently during this crisis. They need to work according to the terms that will suit their own situation. And every single time when they've raised it, the employer has said, fine, thank you for raising it, now we can work around it. So don't be shy. And if you need some help out asking that, come to the Diversity Project and we will give you some tips.
Thanks, Helena. So I'll merge a few other questions, and I was hoping, Emma, you would be keen to answer this one because it's specifically on other industries and how they've dealt with implementing flexible working sort of successfully. It's also specific to fund management. So there's a comment about a situation where if you're a fund manager and you sort of request flexible working, that that could be denied because your job cannot be done outside work once we're back into after the sort of COVID-19 situation, as that needs to be still in the office. But I guess the second layer to that is if the leadership is still resistant to implement flexible working practices long term, are there any good data available for other industries sort of showing the sort of backing the case for longer term sustainable flex that potentially our industry could also use?
Short answer, yes. I think on the point of if you have a flexible working request denied, or you are concerned that it may well be denied just because of the operational nature of your role, we would always advise, that I know the Diversity Project has lots of case studies, but to look within the organisation or to look within your networks, because the chances are you will find somebody who has made it work. And it's really important, if you're making a case to try and negotiate flexibility, to not really lead on the why, as we've discussed, but really the how. So it's about coming up with solutions, and it's about talking to colleagues within your team to explore how you can actually make that case. And you may not always have the answers, but there are a huge number of individual case studies out there of people who have made this work. At Timewise, we have a Power 50 list, people working in very senior roles on a part-time basis. All the stories are on our website, so do have a look, and hopefully that gives some inspiration. In terms of data on other industries, again, there is a huge wealth of information about various different industries that have adopted flexible working. The business case has been really well established. I think that the point to make about how to make that stick within your own organisation, whether you're a manager or an individual trying to make the case, is to contextualise it, and it is really contextualise it in the context of the business opportunity and the missed opportunity for not doing this. So there, we have lots of data points, but I would revert to the conversation we had about the flexibility maturity curve and challenge your business leaders to ask, well, why not? Because in this climate, every business is going to be offering flexible working. And when the markets do start to revert to normal, there is going to be a significant risk, if your business doesn't, that they will lose talent, because there will be a lot of other places that people will be able to go to find flexible work. So it's just about making that individual business case and leveraging what you can see elsewhere is happening.
Thanks, Emma. And if I may add as well, this has been a huge part of our agenda, because specifically for fund managers, where there seems to be barriers of them not being able to work from home, which they have now established that they can. But we have a lady called Rosanna Boccari on our work stream who's very vocal about the fund management piece being very easily done remotely. She's a fund manager herself. So if you would want to speak to me or Rosanna about how you can sort of push this agenda forward, but also the important thing on this is that the working from home might become legal, and once that happens, there's not going to be a case against it. If it doesn't happen, we're also as a work stream at the moment in conversation with FCA to back our initiatives and really support this, that also then supports that fund managers should be working flexibly. So again, more on this to follow, but hopefully we're trying to also move some bits for you so that this sort of really aligns the way for flexibility across all the roles. So, and just on to the next question, Sarah, this one was addressed specifically to you.
Anna-Maria, the sound went off when you were saying the question. Sorry.
Oh, yes. So, Sarah, you mentioned on your presentation that your call center staff are home workers. So the question was about how do you successfully onboard new joiners into full-time home working positions in terms of creating that connection with others and also understanding sort of the cultural aspects that you talked through as well, in order to make them successful in their roles. So what did you find as a business?
So I found that one of the silver linings of this situation is everyone has been incredibly creative and done amazing things very quickly. Our learning and development team created a virtual induction at the drop of a hat. It was amazing to see how quickly they turned it around. And our virtual induction isn't just about how the business works, it's about our culture, and that includes introduction to our communities like Fidelity for Everyone, our D&I networks, and so on. It is very important to build your network at Fidelity. It genuinely does feel like a family. You need to know other people and cooperate with people, and typically when you join us, you'll start by meeting lots of people, and managers are still building that in. They're just virtual meetings. And for me personally, I've certainly found for my global colleagues that actually all of us being on a line helps us have better meetings rather than having some people in a room and some people virtually. So though it might be strange to start a new company without ever leaving your door or going somewhere new, it's definitely possible. The technology is enabled to do it. The induction is now enabled to do it, and those meetings can happen. It's just about having the will to do things differently.
Thank you, Sarah. I think this is definitely sort of the best practice that firms should probably, in the long term, enable, and having the virtual onboarding as a sort of a standard to bulletproof for any future challenges as well. Great. And finally, Steve, I was keen to for you to address the next one. So the challenges of current working from home or just flexibility across generation. It seems that a lot of employees that have reported back to us, as well as in this question, might have struggled with the sort of hours that they've worked. They ended up working sort of 12 hours and, sort of working at a time that they would be usually commuting, with your sort of leadership hat on. And I know that you've been quite passionate about the sort of mental health piece within your organization. What do you see sort of doing most effectively to support employees to not sort of overwork, which could be also a negative effect of not very successful flexible working practices, and to make this sustainable over the long term?
Yeah, I think there's two areas of focus here. One is this has to come from the top. So, myself and my management team, have to set the tone for the business. There's no point, saying we want to do it this way and then me sending emails at 10 o'clock at night. I have to my diary is very visible to everyone in the business, and I have to, walk the talk in this area as my management team do. Secondly, I think it's about training of the middle managers. Ultimately, for flexible working to work, it's all about quality managers able to understand the individual needs of all their teams and respond accordingly. So I think it's about providing training to them and empowering them to kind of meet the needs of each member of the team as is specific to them. Personally, I don't think it's about setting some blanket rules across the whole business.
Great, thanks, Steve. And I guess the final question, because I find this very interesting, and I'll open it to anyone on the panel of the speakers. What would you consider, and this goes back to potentially the gender roles as well as the multi-generational workforce equally, what would you consider a success? So if, in terms of percentage-wise, let's say if a certain percentage of men have taken flexible working practices forward. So I know that some asset managers might have had this target. So for example, I know that obviously Aviva, when they announced the shared parental leave, have had some sort of targets in mind for increasing parental and flexible working practices across both genders. What is, in your view, sort of achievable, and what would your businesses be aiming for?
I think success is going to look like everyone in the business having a contract that works for them. So setting a percentage, whether that's 30%, 40%, 50%, isn't the right thing to do. I think it's about it will come through in staff surveys, and it will come through in your retention figures. If you're providing a flexible enough environment, then you'll have a happy team.
Can I just add quickly, because I agree entirely with Steve, but I also would say that just about everybody in the really senior position in our industry does in effect work flexibly. The more powerful you get, the more opportunity you have to set your own agenda. And I think that's one of the sort of well-kept secrets, really. When the work is done on lots of senior women, particularly, one finds that actually they have been able to work informally on a flexible basis and set their own parameters. And we need to get to that point where we're all trusted to do, obviously, you have to have some ways of having the communications, the connections resolved, and so there need to be sometimes some parameters around it. But I do think we are trying to shift the culture across the piece, not just to set a sort of narrow target for a certain number of people.
I would just add, Anna-Maria, briefly, that I think success should be in the ratio of requests granted, as opposed to the ratio of men and women being able to apply for them. I think it's about having a culture where you move to a place where we are, as individuals, able to have those conversations very openly and transparently, and fundamentally get to a place where actually as Hannah said, the formality and the formal request, which often is the end of the road, doesn't need to happen. It's about individual conversations from day one as to how you're able to do your best work in the best way that suits you.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think we're moving towards a place where everyone, no matter who you are, works flexibly in some way, whether it's about where or how or when you work. But for me, success is really about people feeling that they are trusted and empowered to do their best. And ultimately, the success comes in seeing that the business is doing a great job for our clients because our people feel engaged, empowered, and productive.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you. And I guess to add to that, it's more about creating inclusive workplaces, no matter no matter who you are or the seniority of position that you have. And I think this is also a message that we're really strongly as a work stream trying to encourage to make it a standard for all. So thank you very much again for the questions. If we haven't answered some of these, please feel free to get in touch with me directly. More than happy to cover up that after the session. And I guess to just conclude that we really see this current crisis as serving us as a much needed mandatory catalyst for firms to really implement new ways of working, specifically looking at boosting flexibility and by that also retention, and primarily by removing many of the barriers and management styles of the past, which we have discussed through this session, and bring them in line with a modern multi-generational workforce. In terms of the next steps, we are organizing a webinar led by Timewise on 28th of May, specifically addressing practical suggestions to complement your flexible working action plan. Details to follow, we'll share this with you. We will also be sharing a number of case studies of the Diversity Project member firms with their biggest learnings from this period in the coming weeks on our website and social media. So please stay tuned on that. And finally, we have further webinars in the pipeline for June. Again, we'll keep you posted on that. So I guess I just wanted to say thank you for our speakers for sharing some really interesting content and some feedback from the market. And thank you for everyone who has joined us today. And as I said, please feel free to get in touch with me directly to pass on any feedback, any outstanding questions or any comments. And we wish you a good week ahead.